Hello, welcome to my garden. My name is Jolene, and today's video is a bit different than my normal content. You're in for a treat. This is Liam, my son. The video you're about to see is a very special one. My father, David Stottlemyer, gave lectures around the country on gardening with the beginner gardener in mind. I grew up traveling around the country, mostly on the West Coast, listening to my dad give this seminar series. And my sister and I heard them so many times that we always said we could recite them by heart because we knew where all his jokes were. We knew where, the different things he said. And so it holds a really special place in my heart. Finally, after many years of him giving these lectures, he put these lectures into a 5-part DVD series, and that's what you're watching today, one part of the series. Sadly, my dad passed to his rest in 2013 after a 4-year battle with thyroid cancer. To honor his legacy, our family has decided to release this 5-part DVD series onto YouTube for anyone to access and glean from his knowledge. If you would like to own this 5-part DVD series, then email me in the description down below. I have my email address down there, and we'd be happy to mail you one for the price of $24.99, which includes the shipping and the cost of the DVD. We hope you're blessed by this seminar.
I was forced to make this talk. I usually don't like to talk about irrigation, even though I spent years doing irrigation work with avocados, simply because there's so many variables when it comes to irrigation. It depends on so many different things that it's really hard to put something together on irrigation and talk about it. But they asked me, the last time I gave a talk at a church, they asked me to talk on irrigation, so I went ahead and put it together. And then when they were asking me to do this, Phyllis said, yeah, do irrigation. So you get to hear my least favorite talk. But we will discuss irrigation and see what we can learn from that. Start with a verse again. Then I will give you rain in due season, and the land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Wouldn't it be nice if rain always supplied the irrigation we needed when we needed it? I don't know how it's going to be in heaven. Maybe there'll be a mist that comes up and waters everything. But I'm going to look forward to that day when I don't have to worry about irrigation. Amen, I hear. I second the motion. The Lord shall open unto thee his good treasure, the heaven, to give rain unto thy land in his season, and to bless all the work of thine hand. And thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow. Interesting that this promise that the children of Israel wouldn't have to lend, they would lend and not have to borrow, was part of the blessing that the Lord was going to give to them, including rain in its season and opening treasure to them.
I think they're still lending. I think they're still lending.
Yeah, I think they're still lending. And here's another one. For he shall be as a tree planted by the waters. You can see how important it is, water in a land like Israel where it's dry or can be very dry. And that spreadeth out her roots by the river, and shall not see when heat comes, but her leaf shall be green, shall not be careful in the year of drought, neither shall cease from yielding fruit. If you live in a place where you need to irrigate like I used to, you realize how important good water is and timely water and the application of it. There's my daughter out with a little watering can giving some water to some flowers in front of our house. This was, 4 years ago? Something like that. Some of the issues that make it difficult to talk about: the amount of water to apply, when to apply, this is still an argument among people. How frequent to apply, that's a big one with avocado growers. They don't get into fist fights, but boy, they can be very verbal about how often to apply, how frequent, Method of application. And then you have the compounding factors that make it even more difficult. What soil type do you have? Because that's going to affect how often and the way that you water. The variety of your plant, because different plants have different watering needs. And for me, it gets worse because then you have weather conditions to deal with. Temperature, humidity, wind, all of those things will affect your irrigation. And then you have water quality. Do you have good water? A lot of people up here do have good water. There are some areas where the water's poor, and then what is the problem with your poor water? And you have to take that into account. If you have a lot of salt in your water, you may have to leach periodically to wash those salts down out of the root zone. So all of those things are problems. And then you have your seasons, because your plants, their needs will change as the seasons change. You know, when they're actively growing and they're young, they require a lot of water, and then as they mature and they're starting to die back in the fall, like some of your squash plants or onions, you want to cut back on the water after they have formed. So that's an issue. Soil type, let's talk a little bit about that. What type of soil do you have? If it's sandy, I haven't seen, is there much sandy soil around here? Maybe down by the rivers or something? Most of the soil I've seen here is either a clay or some variation of clay, it seems like. But if you have sandy soil, it drains quick, so you need to water more often. Of course, silt is medium-sized particles. Then you have clay with your real small particles, and that drains slowly, and you have less frequent watering. I was really surprised last year. I had never grown in clay soil until I moved up here, and we had to go away for a week. And when I came back, I just, in my mind, I saw all my corn would be dead, and I mean, everything would be dead, because I mean, down where I used to live, you don't go a week. You can't go a week without watering. I was watering every 2, maybe 3 days. And I came back and everything looked just like it was when I left, and I couldn't believe it. Of course, once the clay soil gets dry, then it's hard to get it wet. I found that out too.
Sir, could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is clay, is it a good or a bad thing?
Well, loam is the best.
Clay is hard to work, but it holds nutrients for a long period of time.
Yeah. It holds nutrients well, it holds water well, but it is hard to work with. Loam is your best soil, and you're fortunate if you have loam, because that's a mixture of sand, clay, and silt. It's considered the best type of garden soil because it has a little bit of everything. So you get the good drainage with the sand, but you have the nutrient holding capacity of the clay and so forth. So what type of soil do you have? Well, there's one way you could tell. You could take some soil and you put it in a glass jar and put a little bit of soil in the bottom. Usually what I do is I'll mark with a marking pin the layer, and you fill it up with water and put a couple of drops of detergent like hand soap or just something to break the surface tension. And then you put a lid on it and shake it real good. Give it a real good shaking. Don't just shake it a couple times, maybe a minute worth of shaking. Then you set it down and you start a little timer, okay? 30 seconds, all your sand will settle out first. So anything that settles out in 30 seconds is sand. Everything between 30 seconds and 2 hours is silt, and everything else is clay. So here's a picture of 3 different ones. So this would be your sand, and then you have a layer. This is sand down here, and this would be your silt. Settles out in 2 hours. And the clay, there's a real fine layer. Can you see that small layer of clay right there? And then there's some trash on top of the clay, but kind of
Trash, organic matter.
the trash is organic matter in this case. And so you have a lot of sand, a little bit of silt, and a real fine layer of clay. And what's left in the water is clay as well. The clay sometimes won't settle out at all. Some of it, it'll just stay suspended in the water. So if you do a test like that, you can fairly quickly see that what are the different components of your soil. And that's a simple test. All you need is a jar and some water and a little bit of detergent.
If it was 80% clay, you wouldn't have it all dissolved yet in 1 minute of shaking.
No, that's why you have to shake it and shake it until it's all dissolved as best as possible. And you don't put a lot of this in the bottom of the jar. I had one person that tried to fill the jar almost all the way up with soil and then tried to do this. You just put some in the bottom.
How long did you say to shake it?
Well, I usually I usually shake it for a good minute, give it a good vigorous shaking for a minute. But like Charlie was saying, if it's clay, you may have to shake it even longer to get it broken up. And you might want to break it up beforehand and put it in there already broken up to some extent. Variety of plant will make a difference on your irrigation. Rapidly growing plants require more water, like your squash, melons, things like that. They require a lot of water. Slow growing plants, herbs do better with less water. So that's something you have to deal with. And what's the original source of your plant? Are your plants from the desert? From the tropics? By the way, sometimes if you overwater tomatoes, have you noticed they'll grow real vigorous, but they won't fruit? That could be a problem. Part of the reason for that is the tomato is native to the tropics. And in the tropics, they have two seasons, a wet and dry. And when the dry season comes, the tomato knows it's time to flower and fruit. During the wet season, it grows vegetatively. So if you give a tomato too much water, and the problem is not always too much water, it's actually air in the soil. If you get all the air out of the soil and it has so much water, the tomato thinks it's in the rainy season, so it just grows vigorously. So you need to cut back on the water so that it thinks it's in dry season now, and then it'll fruit, flower, and fruit. Weather conditions. If you have hot, dry, windy conditions, puts a lot of stress on your plant compared to cool, calm conditions. That makes sense, but some people don't take that into account. You want to increase or decrease your irrigation based on your weather conditions. And down where we were at, we'd get these real dry Santa Ana winds, they called them, and that would really dry things out. So if we ever saw in the forecast that they were coming up, we would start watering ahead of time, especially avocados, which have the big leaves, and they just suck up the water. I mean, when you start getting a wind like that, they just dry out terribly. So if we saw that there was Santa Anas coming up, we'd start pouring on the water ahead of time. Get it into the soil and into the plant so that they could make it through without a problem. Water quality, that's not much of a problem up here, is that right? Yeah, good. You have good water up here for the most part. You may not have enough in some instances, but you have good water when you can get it, right? See, down where we were at, we would have a lot of the water is Colorado River water, and it's all salty. So it already starts high in salt. And so that was an issue where we were at. Best water is pure rainwater if you can get it at the right time. Usually the problem, if the water is not good, is a salt problem. Now, a lot of times if you live in a city, they'll have an analysis that you can actually get. Once a year, they'll send out to the different people, or you can call them up and ask them, I want a report on your water quality. Because a lot of cities, they have to live up to certain federal standards, and they have to publish water tests that they've done. And you can call them up and get that if you live in a city. Now, some states will test well water and tell you what's in the well water. I don't know if Idaho does that or not. And then you have surface water, like runoff and stuff might be an issue if you're dealing with surface water. Now, if you have problem water, the way to deal with it most often is to just do a leaching irrigation, we call it. Ever so often when you irrigate, you put on extra water so that it leaches the problem, and usually it's salts. It'll leach that down out of the root zone of the plants. Deal a little bit with the season. Water needs change as the seasons change and the plant matures. Usually less water is needed as they mature. You know, things for like beans and onions, stuff like that. As they mature, you cut back on the watering. Too much water in the fall reduces frost resistance in perennials. Now, how much do you apply? And that's the question if you're going to be irrigating. Here's another rule of thumb. Do you like rules of thumb? They don't always work, but it's nice to know them. Mature plants need 1 to 2 inches of water per week in the summer. Now, an inch of water is a measurement of depth only. It doesn't tell you how many gallons, it just tells you how deep. And if you're watering with something like a sprinkler or something like that, if you just put a little container out there, a little tin cup or something, it'll tell you, you could just see how deep the water. You run the sprinkler and it'll fill up, and if it's an inch deep, you know you have enough water. And you could shut it off. And you want to apply the water until it's thoroughly soaked. And what I would do the first couple of times is I would just go out, I'd water, go out into the garden after a couple of hours, you know, the water's been shut off, and then I would dig down and see how far down that water's gone. Because you could see how far the water has gone because it changes the color of the soil as it, you know, the moist soil looks different than dry soil. And you want to make sure it goes down at least 12 inches deep. And you usually check it after 24 hours. You give it a chance to soak in. People are often, they water the surface and they think that that's enough because the surface is wet. But if it doesn't soak in very far, you haven't done much good. Now, what if you need to convert inches to gallons? And this, I don't think this is in the handout because I just added this. Is it in the handout? No? Because I had somebody ask me this, and I thought, oh yeah, I should put that in there because sometimes it's good to know, like, this is not so much for your garden, but if you have fruit trees and you need to know, I want to put on an inch of water, how many gallons is that? Because we deal a lot with gallons. Gallons is an actual amount, an inch is a depth, all right? So you want to convert inches of water to gallons. There's a formula, but first you need to know the area that you're irrigating. And you need to know it in square feet. So if you have a bush or a small plant, and in this case, I'm just using, let's say it's a small tree that I'm going to irrigate, and that tree is about 3 feet wide on both sides. So you just assume that instead of being round, just make it square, okay? That makes the calculation easy. So if it's 3 feet by 3 feet, that would be 9 square feet. All right, 3 times 3 is 9. So that it's the area that's shaded by the plant, so to speak. You know about the drip line of a plant? You measure the width on 2 sides, and then you multiply that to get the square feet. So for this example, I'm going 3 feet by 3 feet. As the tree gets bigger, you're going to be watering a bigger area. And then here's the formula. To convert gallons from inches, you take your inches times your spacing in square feet, and then you times it by this conversion factor right here. So in our instance, we have 2 inches that we want to apply, and the tree covers 9 square feet, and you multiply that, 2 times 9 times 0.623, and that gives you 11.2 gallons. So you've converted, you want to put 2 inches on. In order to put 2 inches of water on that tree, you need to apply 11.2 gallons. And if you have your trees on a emitter or a drip system, and you know how many gallons that puts out, if it puts out 5 gallons per hour, then you would run that system for a little over 2 hours and you would have enough water for that tree. Do you see how that works? Okay. Now you could do the same thing in your garden if you have a bed that's, you know, let's say it's 10 feet long by 3 feet wide, and 10 times 3, you get 30 square feet, and you can do the same sort of calculation. And you say, I want to put an inch of water on, and then you can do the calculation, and that'll give you how many gallons to put on. And there are, this controller works by time, but they do make little controllers that work by gallons too. So if you know how many gallons your system needs to run, you could dial in the gallons and it'll run until that number of gallons has gone through. It's called a Burmad valve. And it'll run for that many gallons and then it'll shut off automatically. Checking for soil moisture. Most garden plants need moisture in the top 12 inches of the soil. To check, again, you dig down 12 inches. I've mentioned this before. You want to water if the top 6 inches is dry. Put on some water. Wait a few hours and check again. Again, this tells you how deep the water's gone. I worked at a school farm, and the irrigator, who was the farm manager at that time, he'd go out and he'd grab a handful of soil and, you know, squeeze it and break it with his thumb. And if it stayed together real good. Then he knew it had enough moisture in it. If it broke up and was kind of cloddy, then he'd know it's time to irrigate. He was good at it. Now there are little meters if you want to use them. Like this little meter, you stick it, it's kind of like that pH meter that I demonstrated out in the garden. This one does for soil moisture. You just put it in the soil and it'll tell you what the moisture level is in the soil. You could also use a tensiometer. A tensiometer is it looks like this. I have an old one here. And this is an old, it's broken now. I used it and broke it. But what it has is a porous clay tip on it. And you fill it up with water. And it has a vacuum gauge at the top. You put the water in here at the top. And fill it all the way up. And it has a rubber stopper at the top. So when you screw this back down, it makes a seal, a tight seal. And then what happens is as the soil dries, it draws moisture through this porous clay tip, and it creates a vacuum that you can read on this gauge. All right? Real clever little way of telling soil moisture. And you can get these at different depths. And not only that, but if you don't want to take the time to go out and read the gauge, you can have them hooked up to a transducer, they call it, and it'll turn things on and off for you. So it'll automatically turn water on, and then when it gets wet, it turns it off. They use these at golf courses and stuff. And then probably twice a month or 3 times a month, you have to open this up and put water back in, or the fluid back in, the water, because what will happen is as it draws the water out, it creates a vacuum here, but it uses water, and you got to put the water back and start it, reset it. And then the gauge, which in this case, my gauge is all discolored from time. But you look here, when the reading, as I say here, when it gets up to about 20 centibars for sandy soil or about 30 centibars for loam, then you know it's dry enough to water. And like I said, this is a kind of a scientific way to tell what your soil moisture is, what's happening in your soil at the particular depth. So if you want to read it at 12 inches, you get a 12-inch one of these. And it'll tell you what's happening in your soil as far as soil moisture. So when do you water? Yeah, when you can. Evening and early morning are best times to water because less water is lost to evaporation. On diseased plants in the morning, so the plant leaves will dry overnight. What type of plants are we talking about there? Tomatoes don't like their leaves wet ever. Yeah, roses. So if you have tomatoes and you do have to water them with an overhead or with a sprinkler system, do it early in the morning and give them a chance to dry out completely before the night comes. That way you're avoiding disease problems. Same thing with roses or anything like. I wouldn't sprinkle roses, but you might have to in some cases. And how frequent do you apply? Most plants prefer a slight drying period between irrigation. This encourages deeper rooting. Water once or twice a week. Now they set up with avocados, this was a big argument. I mentioned this earlier. A lot of people were arguing, well, how often do we water? Do we water once a day, once a week, or do we water 2 or 3 times a week? And boy, they were going back and forth. And so they all got together and decided to fund a research project. And that actually is what I initially started working on when I started working with avocados, this big research project. And what we discovered, interesting enough, was that the trees that were watered every single day did not do as well as the ones that were watered every other day. Let them dry out a little bit in between irrigation. And the ones that were watered every other day did better than the ones that were watered once a week. The ones that were watered once a week, that was too long a gap in the soil that they were in. The trees were drying out too much. So once a day was too much, once a week was too little, and about every other day was just about right for the avocado down in California. So in case up here in Idaho, you probably would want to experiment a little with how often with your clay soil, you probably don't have to water that often. But let your plants, give them a good soaking, let them dry out some before you irrigate again. Now here I wrote down some gardeners recommend small daily irrigation so the plant never suffers. Hey, we have another one here. Somebody had a dot there. Back here. I like that. So what are the watering methods? You could use hand watering. I had a picture of my daughter earlier. There she is watering with a little hand. I actually use a hand watering system for my little plants that I start in pots and things like that. So, I mean, there's a place for hand watering. You can also use sprinklers. There are a lot of different types of sprinklers. The wigwag, I use that sometimes in my garden. Soaker hose. This is popular in some places. Do any people around here use soaker hose? Okay, we got some soaker hose people. And down south, they use that with strawberries. They'll put that underneath the, they'll plant the strawberries, put down a soaker hose, and then they'll put the tarp, the plastic on top. And so the soaker hose is underneath the plastic. They use the regular plastic that the water can't go through. Soaker hose, how long do they last with your good water up here? Before they get plugged up? 3 years? Sometimes you can run an acid through them if the problem is calcium buildup, but drip irrigation, this was developed by the Israelis because Israel is an area that, they have a lot of problems with water. They still do. I went over and visited Israel. The Lord opened up a door for me to go visit the avocado industry in Israel right when they were having peace, before the recent problems broke. Well, not recent now, but it was right before all the problems broke out between the Palestinians and the Israelis. They had a little period of peaceful relations, and I happened to go over during that time, and they do a lot with drip irrigation over there because water is such a precious thing, and they have so little of it over there. Here's a little emitter, drip type emitter. Flood and furrow irrigation, basin irrigation, this is another type. And again, the picture of this is a siphon system and flooding your crops. This uses a lot of water, but it is effective. If you have a lot of water, it's a good way of watering your crops. Now, there are a lot of different timers. They work best with your drip, soaker hose, or sprinkler system again. This one that I'm holding up here uses no electricity. It's just a dial type, and you just dial in the number of hours you want it to run. It goes all the way from just turning it on and it stays on. And then you can go to 3 hours, 2.5, 2, 1.5, and so forth. And it'll automatically shut off when it's run that length of time. Like I said, they also have the same type that you can dial in the number of gallons, and it'll shut off after the gallons has run. That's a different type. It's a Burmad valve, they call it. Then they have controllers that work with a little battery, a radio battery, and they have them digital and dial. This is a dial type. You just dial in what you want it to do. And, I guess I still have a battery in here. It's flashing. But it'll turn on and water automatically. You could set it for every other day and set it for a certain amount of time and so forth. And these are real nice because you just screw them onto your water source. But, of course, you need to have a water source that's on and enough pressure to run one of these things because it needs a certain amount of pressure to turn on and to turn off. So if you have a situation where you need to turn on a pump, then you have to figure something else out. And they have these that'll run more than one. It'll have one dial here, but it'll run 2 or even 3 different lines. And you could set each line for something different. So if you have one water source, and yet you have water going to, say, like berries, and to fruit trees, and to a garden where each one requires a different amount of water, you could just set it, and each one will come on individually and run for the right amount of time for those. And they, like I said, they work with radio batteries, so it's not hooked up to your electric system. They have some of these that are solar powered, and by having them on a radio battery, even if you lose power, which we do up at our house all the time, it doesn't mess your water system up. Irrigation line. So you can have systematic watering of your plants. It's a nice thing to know that when you go away for a week or two, or if you have something that calls you away from your house, everything is going to get watered. But you do need to adjust it for your season. And like at my mom's house, she has all her stuff on, because she's on oxygen. My dad has passed away and my mom lives by herself and she's on oxygen. She can't get out and do stuff a lot. So I set up an irrigation system for her where everything was watered on drips or sprinklers or whatever. And then like 3 times a year, I have a little sheet that tells her what month and to go out and either bump it up or turn it back. And it's fairly simple and she can do that and adjust for the season, which you want to do because you need more water during the summer, and then during the winter you need little, if any. And there's a wide variety of timers, like I already mentioned, that you can get for all kinds of different needs. And again, this is we showed this I think in the first talk, but this is our little raised bed, and you can see our little drip line coming here. It's the poly tubing, and we have a riser. Let me show you what this little system is. Here's a base, and you put the tube here where my finger is, and you put a hole in it, and then this part here is angled and it goes down. I'm not going to put that through my finger, but you just slip this down in. Here it go in there, and this part slips into the plastic tubing, and it makes a nice seal. And then this is a little spinner type, so it's a little sprinkler, a micro sprinkler. And you can get these to put out different amounts of water. And it's adjustable because this system has a little riser. So usually what I do is I'll take this part off. And early in the season when my sprinkler doesn't need to be up very high, I just put the sprinkler down low like this, see? And it throws it onto my garden. But as it grows, then I'll add one so it's higher. And if I need to, I'll add 2 even. It gets a little wobbly when it gets real high. And I can move it around, pick my tubing up and move it if I need to water different sections. And it puts on a nice light spray of water. It's not like your rainbirds, it's a real harsh. This is more like rain falling, real gentle. So you have to run it for a while, but it's real nice.
Where do you get this?
Where do you get these up here? You can order these through your catalogs. I used to get them at a place called Farm Supply, something Farm Supply. I believe I saw them in Lewiston at that irrigation store too, so they may have them there. You might, huh? Right as you come into Lewiston, there's that irrigation place on the right.
D&D on Same Road, and there's quite a bit in Home Depot too.
Okay, I've not seen this in Home Depot, but they do carry a lot of stuff. This one I got from Home Depot. This is a little spray type, and again, you just put a little hole. I use a ice pick, put a hole in my poly tubing, and stick this in, and this can be moved around, and it puts out a spray. These are real nice for around something like a fruit tree. If you get one that has what's called a notch, meaning it sprays out in a fan pattern, but doesn't spray back against the tree itself. So it sprays away from the tree, but is not spraying on the base of the tree. And you can put one on either side of the tree if you want to, and it sprays out in a pattern. And you can buy these with different heads on them, so as the tree grows bigger, it sprays in a bigger pattern, puts out more water. And there's so much when it comes to irrigation that you can hardly cover all of that. We put in a big, huge irrigation trial in California with the avocados and used the spinner type emitters like this. And we actually had to go through, the trees did so well that they outgrew the ability of the sprinkler to put enough water on the trees. And so we had to change them. I had to go through and swap them all for ones that could put out more water because the trees they shot up and grew so vigorously that the trees, we couldn't put enough water. In a 7-day week, we couldn't put enough water on the trees. They just were doing so well, so we had to go through. And that's the nice thing about these type of emitters. You can get them with different amounts that they'll put out. And that's the end of my irrigation talk. Do we have any questions about irrigation? Okay.
Why do you prefer the spray over the drip system?
Well, I don't prefer the spray over the drip system, but in certain circumstances, the spray works better. For example, the drip, if you're dealing with a smaller crop that's going to be in one spot for a period of time, a drip that'll cover that area works really nice. But if you're dealing with a plant that gets fairly large and its roots extend like fruit trees, I prefer to have something that sprays over that whole area rather than individual drips. Now, the Israelis, what they do is they have individual drips and they'll put a whole bunch of them and then they move them, because what will happen is the tree will put all its roots right where the emitter is. And then there'll be an area where it's dry in between the emitters. So the Israelis will put individual emitters because they do use less water than something like this. You still get evaporation with a system like this. And they are so tight with their water that they put individual emitters and they put a bunch of them around the tree, and then they hire, work is cheap, labor is cheap there, so they just hire someone to go and move the emitters, every month or so they just move them. So that way the water, where it was wet this month, next month it's wet over here, and then the tree keeps having to move its roots around to follow the water.
So then I'm back to the fruit trees. If you don't want to water your tree trunks, you want the water to spread out. How do you get a sprayer that sprays short enough so under little baby trees like mine are, they don't go out forever and ever?
Right, and I don't have that type of emitter here, but they make a special emitter. It's a spray cap. It's a sprayer like this type where it just sprays, all right, out in a fan shape. And they have a special cap that you put on top, and it'll only spray out about this far. And the cap deflates the water and it just dribbles out. And then what happens is as the tree grows, when it reaches the point where you need it to go further, you just take the cap off and then it sprays out further.
So did you get that at Home Depot or where?
No, I've not seen those at Home Depot, but you can get those through catalogs. And if that's something you're really interested in, I could see if I could track that down for you. Fruit Growers Supply is the name of the place that we used to get a lot of our more specialized irrigation stuff. And I don't know if they have that up here. They're not very common, but they carried a lot of good irrigation stuff. And I need to look at the place in Lewiston again to see what they have, because they may have the same type of stuff.
Probably find them online.
Hmm?
Probably find them online.
Probably find them online, yeah. Any more questions on that, on irrigation?
Do you ever do any of the fertilizing through your system?
Well, I've not at home. Mainly I do organic, and there are some organic soluble fertilizers you can put through irrigation system, but I've never done that. Now, I've done that with avocado orchards where we do fertigation, they call it, and it uses a little tube and you make a solution and it'll draw it. Every time it irrigates, it draws a little bit of fertilizer and puts it on the trees. Are you interested in that? Yeah. And they have some systems where it works on a Venturi system where it actually draws the fertilizer in with no moving parts, meaning you don't need an electrical, you don't need a big system. All you need is flowing water. And then it draws the nutrient solution up into the system at the right amount for your tree or your crop.
We have some fruit trees, but they're pretty far away from where our water supply is. Would you just need to get a hose to go out there to where the tree is, or is there some special water thing you can put on the tree?
Well, the poly tubing is not terribly expensive. I probably would, I don't know what your situation is, but you can run poly tubing and it can carry quite a capacity. I don't know how big your orchard is, but one thing with the poly tubing you should be aware of is certain animals like coyotes, especially the pups, tend to want to chew on the poly tubing, and they'll mess it up terrible. When they get a little older, they won't. And so if you can cover it just with a little bit of leaf litter or even a little bit of soil so they can't see it, then you won't have a problem with that if you have coyotes in your area. Any other questions?